Most people, and by extension most nations, tend to play it safe. They cling to what is known, even when what is known is inadequate, because the unknown is terrifying. The unknown is full of uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of failure. But it is also the place where all genuine growth resides. No person and no country ever becomes something extraordinary by simply repeating what has already been done. It is only by stepping outside the boundary of comfort that transformation becomes possible. And the world, by its very structure, punishes both recklessness and cowardice, but rewards courage that is tethered to responsibility. The path forward requires strength to break away from mediocrity. To attempt what others fear is precisely what distinguishes leaders from followers. When we look at the course of history, almost all great transformations are the result of bold acts. Consider the discoveries of science, the revolutions of culture, and the leaps in governance. None of them came from those who remained content with the familiar. They came from individuals or nations that were willing to endure risk. To dare is to accept the possibility of pain, but also to claim the possibility of greatness. And when India acted in a way that no other nation had the courage to do, it did not simply take a step forward. It broke a mold that kept others confined. The mold is like a psychological prison where safety is worshipped at the cost of progress. To break that mold is to declare independence from fear. It is to say, we will lead, even if the price is high. The human mind is wired to avoid danger, and that instinct is deeply rooted in biology. For millions of years, survival depended on staying away from what was unpredictable, but in the modern world, that instinct becomes a trap. Avoiding risk may keep you alive, but it also keeps you small. It confines you to the arena of mediocrity, where nothing is ventured and nothing is gained. That is why courage is so rare. It requires acting against your deepest instincts. A nation, like an individual, must be willing to move into the unknown despite the fear. India's action revealed this truth on a grand scale. It was not recklessness, but responsibility that demanded boldness. In that act, India embodied the very essence of courage. We have to remember that fear whispers the same message to everyone. Stay where you are. Do not move. Do not risk. And most people obey it. Most governments, too, become paralyzed under its weight. They build committees, they hold endless meetings, they wait for certainty that never comes. But certainty is an illusion, because life itself is uncertain. If you wait for perfect safety, you will wait forever. And in that waiting, opportunity dies. But India, at that crucial moment, understood something profound. There is a greater danger in inaction than in action. To stay still while the world shifts is not safety, it is decline. And so, India dared to move where others froze. The mold that India shattered was not simply geopolitical, it was psychological. It was the mold of conformity, the mold of hesitation, the mold of thinking that greatness belongs only to others. To break such a mold requires not just power, but vision. Vision allows you to see beyond the immediate cost into the long-term gain. And vision is only accessible to those who have discipline, because without discipline, vision collapses into fantasy. What India displayed was discipline combined with courage, and that creates transformation. That is a lesson every young person must absorb. Discipline without courage is stagnation, and courage without discipline is chaos. But together they generate progress, and that is what the world witnessed. There is a story that repeats itself in the lives of individuals and nations alike. The refusal to step beyond what is known leads to decay. You can see it in a person who never dares to speak their mind, who never dares to pursue their potential. Slowly they become bitter, resentful, envious of those who dared. The same pattern plays out at the scale of nations. Countries that avoid risk remain dependent on those that embrace it. They become spectators in history rather than authors of it. India, by refusing to remain a spectator, declared itself an author. It was an act of self-determination, a choice to move from passivity to agency. That shift is what separates those who lead from those who follow. Risk is frightening because it exposes you to failure, and failure is humiliating. But what is worse than humiliation is the slow corrosion of potential unrealized. Every human being has a sense of who they could be, and every nation has a sense of what it could become. To betray that sense, to turn away from it, is the most profound form of suffering. You may avoid temporary embarrassment, but you guarantee long-term despair. India's choice, then, was not simply strategic. It was moral. It was a moral statement that the pursuit of greatness matters more than the avoidance of discomfort. That is the kind of message that reverberates through generations. That is why it inspired the world. The courage to break the mold always comes with resistance. Those who remain in fear resent those who move beyond it. They criticize, they condemn, they say, it was too risky, it was irresponsible, it cannot be sustained. But beneath that criticism lies envy. Because deep down, every individual knows they could have acted, but chose not to. And when they see another succeed, it reflects their own cowardice back at them. India's boldness forced the world to confront its own hesitation. That is part of why it was so respected, and yes, so feared. Respect emerges from strength, and fear emerges when that strength exposes the weakness of others. This dynamic is timeless. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the mastery of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite trembling hands and an anxious heart. Nations, like individuals, feel this trembling. They are afraid of economic backlash, of military risk, of political instability. But if those fears govern every choice, nothing meaningful will ever be done. And so, courage becomes the highest virtue, not because it is reckless, but because it enables every other virtue to manifest. Without courage, truth cannot be spoken, responsibility cannot be taken, and progress cannot be made. What India demonstrated is that a nation can embody this virtue, and that embodiment serves as a model for the entire world. And that is precisely why no country dared to do it, but India did. Every human being faces a choice when confronted with hardship, to see themselves as a victim of circumstance, or as someone responsible for creating meaning out of suffering. This is true for individuals, and it is true for nations. Victimhood is seductive because it offers the comfort of blame. You can always point outward towards history, towards oppressors, towards systems, and say, it isn't my fault. But the tragedy is that when you do this, you surrender your power. You hand over your agency to the very forces you resent. Responsibility, by contrast, is heavy and it hurts. Yet, it is the only path that leads to transformation because it insists, I will bear the burden. I will act despite the weight. When a nation chooses responsibility, it signals a fundamental psychological shift. Instead of dwelling on injustices, it begins to ask, what can we do now? What steps can we take, regardless of how unfair the past has been? That is a radical orientation toward the world. It is the difference between stagnation and renewal. India, in this moment, showed precisely that kind of orientation. It would have been easy to fall into resentment, to complain endlessly about the structures stacked against it. Many nations do exactly that, but India recognized that progress requires carrying the burden, not denying it. And by doing so, it modeled a principle that every individual should live by. Responsibility is the antidote to despair. Resentment is poisonous. At first, it feels like strength because it lets you rage against injustice. But over time, it corrodes the soul, leaving nothing but bitterness and envy. You see this in people who never take responsibility. They are perpetually angry, perpetually complaining, and perpetually stuck. Nations fall into the same trap. They externalize their failures, blaming larger powers or historical oppression. And in doing so, they become weaker, not stronger. India's action was the opposite of resentment. It was a declaration that victimhood would not define it. That choice was both moral and pragmatic, because resentment only multiplies suffering, while responsibility transforms it into growth. Carrying responsibility is not glamorous. It is not the heroic fantasy that people imagine. It is waking up each day to tasks that are difficult, exhausting, and often thankless. Responsibility means voluntarily picking up a burden you could ignore. And yet, that is precisely where dignity is found. Dignity emerges when you say, "Yes, the weight is heavy, but I will carry it anyway." That is the stance India took when it decided to act rather than complain. And that stance echoes the deepest truths of human existence. That meaning is discovered not in pleasure or comfort, but in the bearing of responsibility. Without responsibility, life collapses into nihilism. With it, even suffering becomes purposeful. When we talk about responsibility at the national scale, we must understand that it is never easy. There are always excuses available, always reasons to step back. Global pressures, economic uncertainties, historical wounds. All of these can be used to justify inaction. But just as an individual cannot become strong by avoiding struggle, a nation cannot become great by avoiding its burdens. India's choice demonstrated that responsibility must be chosen even when conditions are unfair, especially when conditions are unfair. Because it is in those moments that the choice matters most. To act despite injustice is the essence of moral strength. And moral strength, once demonstrated, reverberates far beyond a single moment. Responsibility also requires sacrifice. You cannot take on responsibility without giving up certain comforts, without facing certain criticisms, without enduring certain losses. That is the price of strength. Many people refuse responsibility because they want the rewards without the sacrifice. Many nations, too, demand respect without paying the cost of courage. But India's decision revealed an uncomfortable truth. You cannot have progress without sacrifice. You must give up the ease of victimhood, the false comfort of blame in order to step forward. Sacrifice transforms weakness into strength, and that is why it is inseparable from responsibility. Those unwilling to sacrifice remain forever trapped in dependence. It is worth noting that responsibility is frightening precisely because it exposes you to failure. If you admit responsibility, you also admit that if things go wrong, it is on you. That is a terrifying reality. But it is also the foundation of true confidence, because once you accept that burden, you no longer live in fear of others. You no longer wait for saviors or scapegoats. You become the author of your own story. India, in its choice, embodied this psychological truth. By taking responsibility, it accepted the possibility of failure, but also the possibility of greatness. That is the trade every individual must make. That is the essence of freedom, the willingness to bear the risk of responsibility. When a person embraces responsibility, they grow stronger. When a nation does the same, it grows respected. Respect is not given to those who dwell in excuses. It is earned by those who accept burdens willingly. India's decision resonated because it signaled to the world that responsibility would take precedence over victimhood. That act of responsibility created admiration because the world knows how rare it is. Most people collapse under responsibility. Most nations avoid it entirely. But those who do carry it become leaders because others look to them as examples. Leadership is not about power alone. It is about showing that you are willing to carry more than your share of the burden. The truth is that life is not fair, and it never will be. The world is harsh, unequal, and filled with tragedy. But that does not absolve you from responsibility. It intensifies it, because if you do not act, the unfairness only multiplies. That is the paradox of existence. Even though you did not create all the conditions of your life, you must take responsibility for them anyway. Nations face the same paradox. India did not create every difficulty it endured, but it acted as though it could. And that choice set it apart, because to live without responsibility is to surrender to chaos. To live with it is to impose order on chaos. And that is what India dared to do. The world is, by its very nature, chaotic. Things fall apart, systems collapse, and unpredictability is the only constant. Chaos surrounds every individual life in the form of illness, uncertainty, and death. Chaos surrounds nations in the form of shifting economies, sudden wars, and cultural upheavals. And yet, it is precisely from chaos that order must be carved. To wait until everything is certain is to wait forever. There will never be a perfect moment, never a risk-free environment. The only choice is whether to cower in paralysis or to impose structure upon disorder. The greatest transformations in history come when someone dares to create order where there was none. Most nations retreat in the face of chaos. They treat unpredictability as justification for inaction. They hesitate, they calculate endlessly, they hope the storm will pass without requiring them to move. But storms rarely pass, they intensify. And those who fail to act in the storm are often destroyed by it. India chose differently. It saw chaos not as an excuse to wait, but as an opportunity to assert vision. To impose order on chaos is a deeply creative act, requiring courage, discipline, and clarity. It is not safe, but it is transformative. And those who master it are remembered as leaders. Chaos frightens us because it reminds us of our fragility. We realize that we are small, vulnerable, and mortal in the face of forces beyond our control. That recognition is terrifying, and it drives many to avoid responsibility. But avoidance never works because chaos is relentless. It does not vanish when ignored. The only real option is to confront it directly, to stare into the unknown, and respond with action. This is as true for nations as it is for individuals. India's choice was to confront rather than avoid. In doing so, it revealed that the way forward is not to fear chaos, but to engage with it and transform it into something meaningful. Order is what gives life structure, meaning, and stability. It allows societies to flourish, economies to grow, and individuals to plan their futures. But order never arises by accident. It must be constructed, deliberately and often painfully. Someone must shoulder the responsibility of building it. That is why chaos is also opportunity, because it creates the space for new forms of order to emerge. India's boldness was to step into that space when others hesitated. By doing so, it transformed unpredictability into momentum. That is the essence of leadership, the ability to bring coherence to disorder. Without such acts, history would stagnate in fear. To create order from chaos requires vision. You must be able to see beyond the immediate turmoil into a future that could be shaped by action. Vision is not fantasy. It is the disciplined imagination of what could be if courage were applied. Most nations lack vision. They see only the turbulence of the present. But visionaries are different. They see the chaos and ask, what can be built here? What structure can we impose? India acted in precisely that way. It looked beyond uncertainty into possibility. That is how order is generated, by those who have the courage to imagine and the discipline to execute. The danger of chaos is that it paralyzes. People become overwhelmed by the unpredictability and refuse to move. Nations do the same, trapped in indecision, fearing every possible outcome. But paralysis is itself a choice that guarantees decay. If you do not move forward, you are moved backward by the relentless force of time. India avoided paralysis by daring to act amidst uncertainty. It refused to let fear of the unknown dictate its destiny. That decision was not without risk, but it was filled with potential. And it revealed a principle that every person should adopt. Movement in the face of chaos is the only path to order. Order does not mean perfection. It does not mean everything will go smoothly, or that every risk will be eliminated. It means that structure is created where there was once only confusion. Think of it like a builder shaping raw stone into a foundation. The stone itself is rough, jagged, and chaotic, but when shaped by deliberate effort, it becomes the basis for a home. India's decision was to take the jagged stone of global chaos and begin to carve it. That act is difficult, imperfect, and open to criticism, but it is also essential. Without builders of order, chaos reigns unchecked, and unchecked chaos is destruction. To face chaos requires both humility and strength. Humility, because you must recognize that you do not control everything. Strength, because you must act anyway, despite that recognition. Many nations lack one or the other. Some are arrogant, believing they can dominate chaos with no preparation, and they collapse. Others are weak, refusing to act at all, and they wither. But India's strength lay in its balance of humility and boldness. It knew the risks, but it did not retreat. It embraced the paradox of human existence, that you must act without full control. That is how order is carved out of the unknown. There is a lesson here for every individual. Your life, too, is filled with chaos, uncertainties about your future, fears about your abilities, doubts about your worth. If you wait until everything is perfect before you act, you will never act. If you demand certainty before responsibility, you will remain paralyzed. The challenge is to act anyway, to bring order to your personal chaos. That is what growth looks like, building stability in the midst of uncertainty. India, at the national scale, did what each person must do individually. It chose courage over paralysis. And that choice transformed chaos into progress. When we look back at moments of history, we admire those who dared to bring order out of chaos. We remember them not because they avoided risk, but because they embraced it and built something enduring. That is why India's decision was so striking. It showed the world that chaos does not have to be feared. It can be mastered. And mastery does not mean eliminating unpredictability, but organizing it into a structure that serves growth. That act of transformation is the heart of leadership. And when it is done with vision, courage, and responsibility, it becomes an example to all who witness it. When one nation dares to act boldly, it does not only alter its own trajectory, it reshapes the expectations of the world around it. Boldness creates ripples like a stone cast into still water, expanding outward far beyond the initial point of impact. Others who were hesitant suddenly begin to ask themselves whether they too could act. Boldness is contagious because it demonstrates possibility where before there was only fear. When India stepped forward, it declared to the world that hesitation is not destiny. That declaration broke the illusion that courage was impossible. And in breaking it, India shifted the psychological landscape not only for itself, but for others. The ripple effect of boldness works on individuals in exactly the same way. When one person chooses courage in the face of overwhelming odds, it becomes a model for others. We all look to those who act when we are uncertain. Their example proves that risk can be endured, that responsibility can be shouldered, that chaos can be confronted. India, through its act, became such a model at the national scale. It showed that boldness is not reserved for the already powerful. It is forged through decisive action. This truth reverberates in the hearts of those who witness it. It whispers to them, if they can, perhaps I can too. Respect is never given to the timid, it is granted to those who dare. And when boldness is displayed, respect follows as a natural consequence. The world respects not because the path was easy, but because it was difficult, dangerous, and yet pursued. Fear also emerges because boldness destabilizes the expectations of others. If one nation can act with courage, then the excuses of others are exposed as weakness. That exposure generates discomfort, and discomfort generates fear. India's boldness had this dual effect: admiration from some, anxiety from others. But in both cases, its influence expanded, because courage commands attention. The most remarkable thing about bold action is that it outlives the moment in which it occurs. Acts of hesitation vanish into obscurity, but acts of courage echo through time. Children learn about them, generations inherit their lessons, and societies are shaped by their consequences. When India acted boldly, it was not just making a strategic choice for the present, it was planting a seed for the future. That seed grows in the imagination of the young, teaching them that daring is possible, and once such an idea takes root, it cannot easily be extinguished. Boldness becomes a tradition, a narrative that sustains identity. Every great transformation in human history began with someone willing to step first. It is always the first act of courage that is hardest, because the path is uncharted. But once it is taken, others find it easier to follow. The trailblazer breaks through resistance, showing that the barrier was never absolute. India's decision played that role. It carved out a path where none had been before, making it easier for others to imagine walking a similar road. That is the ripple effect, not only changing your own course, but lowering the threshold of fear for others. That contribution multiplies beyond calculation. It is worth remembering that boldness does not guarantee immediate success. Sometimes it brings criticism, setbacks, or even failure, but even then it reshapes the possibilities of the future. Because once someone dares, the idea of daring itself becomes part of the collective imagination. Failure in courage is still more admirable than success in cowardice. Nations and individuals who act boldly, even imperfectly, inspire others more than those who never try. India's act embodied this principle. It revealed that the true measure of courage is not flawless execution, but the willingness to step forward when others retreat. That willingness is what endures. The ripple effect is not only external, it is internal. When you act boldly, you alter your own perception of yourself. You begin to see yourself as capable, resilient, and strong. That shift in identity is permanent, because it proves something to you that no words could convince you of. Nations undergo this same transformation. India's act was not just for the world, it was for itself. It proved to its own people that boldness was within them, that courage could define their destiny. That self-perception becomes a source of strength, feeding further acts of daring. Boldness, once practiced, becomes self-sustaining. This is why courage is such a profound responsibility. Your boldness is never just your own. It belongs to everyone who witnesses it. Your children, your neighbors, your community, they are all shaped by your actions. Nations, too, shape not only their citizens but the world through their choices. When India chose courage, it gave permission for others to imagine courage too. And that permission is powerful, because many are waiting for a sign that they can act. Boldness lights the path, and once illuminated, others follow. That is how transformation spreads, from one act to countless imitations across time and space. The ripple effect also challenges the complacent. Those who live in hesitation are forced to confront their own unwillingness when boldness is displayed before them. They can no longer hide behind excuses of impossibility, because possibility has been proven. This creates tension, sometimes even hostility, because courage makes cowardice visible. But that tension is necessary. It is through such confrontation that growth occurs. India's act unsettled many precisely because it showed that fear was not an absolute barrier. And once fear is revealed as conquerable, it loses its hold. That is how courage disrupts and renews, simultaneously. Ultimately, the ripple effect of boldness is that it changes what people believe about themselves, and belief is the foundation of action. When a nation like India demonstrates that daring is possible, it alters the realm of what seems achievable. People who once thought we cannot begin to wonder, perhaps we can. That shift is the birthplace of progress. Boldness is not just a momentary act. It is a transformation of imagination itself. And when imagination is transformed, the future is reshaped. That is the enduring power of courage, its capacity to echo through generations, altering the destinies of all who witness it.